You're watching a man run out of exits. Paris, the 11th of March, 1932. Ivar Kreuger sits down with his banker and his closest lieutenant to plan one final trip to Berlin to beg for emergency money. He controls 2/3 of every match struck on Earth. He has taken $250 million from ordinary Americans to get there. His weapon was never a gun. It was a signature. By the following morning, he is dead, and the largest bankruptcy the world has ever seen is about to open on Wall Street. What they don't tell you about the man who lent money to governments is that he carried a gold coin in a leather locket against his chest and believed it kept him safe. To understand why a man like that stops answering questions, you have to go back 30 years to a boy in a Swedish match town who had already worked out that silence was worth more than any explanation. He was born on the 2nd of March, 1880 in Kalmar on the Baltic coast of Sweden into a family that made matches. It was an unglamorous trade. Timber, phosphorus, paraffin. Fractions of a penny multiplied by the millions. Kreuger was quick enough to skip grades, and he left the Royal Institute of Technology at 20 with degrees in both mechanical and civil engineering. Then he did something almost nobody in his position did. He left. He worked as an engineer in the United States. He worked in South Africa. He was in his 20s, and he was working a long way from Kalmar. When he came home, he did not go back into matches. On the 18th of May, 1908, he went into business with a man named Paul Toll, and they founded a construction firm. Kreuger and Toll pioneered reinforced concrete in Scandinavia. But the innovation that made Kreuger's name was not structural. It was a promise. He offered to finish buildings ahead of schedule and to be paid a bonus when he did. He was betting on his own certainty in public, with money attached. And he kept winning the bet. People who met him in those years described a quiet man, not a salesman. He carried his own luggage. He answered his own telephone. He could recite international economic figures from memory in a flat voice with total conviction, and Wall Street titans came away impressed. Asked once for the secret of managing a company, he gave a 3-word answer: silence, silence, and more silence. By 1917, he had enough capital to go back to the industry he was born into, and he took it apart and put it back together. He consolidated the fragmented Swedish match business into a single company, Svenska Tändsticks Aktiebolaget, Swedish Match. And then he ran into the limit of the whole idea. Sweden is small. There are only so many matches one small country can strike. It is worth seeing what he actually owned because it was not abstract. In the factory towns of Sweden, at Jönköping and elsewhere, continuous match machines ran day and night, massive contraptions of cast iron and steel. Fed with raw timber splints, dipping millions of sticks an hour into vats of phosphorus and paraffin and boxing them in yellow and blue cardboard. The air smelled of sulfur. The floors were loud. And the product coming off those lines was the cheapest, most ordinary object in the world. That was the empire. That was what all of it was built on. So he looked at the map. And what he saw on it was not a market, it was a condition. Europe, after the First World War, was broke. Not poor, broke. Governments had spent themselves hollow and needed hard currency to rebuild, and there was almost none of it on the continent. Across the Atlantic, the United States had the opposite problem. America had a surplus of capital and a growing appetite for somewhere to put it. Kreuger put himself in the middle. He went to finance ministers with an offer that sounded to them like the only good news of the decade. He would lend their government millions of American dollars. In exchange, his companies would receive an exclusive national monopoly on matches running for decades. The government got the money it desperately needed. Kreuger got a captive market of everyone in the country who ever lit a cigarette or a stove. But he did not have that money either. He had to go and get it. And on the 26th of October, 1923, in New York, he found the people who would hand it to him. Lee, Higginson and Company was a Boston investment bank founded in 1848. blue-blooded, discreet, and trusted absolutely. Together, they launched the International Match Corporation, IMCO, with a $15 million public offering that was massively oversubscribed on the day. IMCO had exactly one purpose, and it was stated plainly in its design: to funnel American retail capital into European sovereign loans. Lee Higginson did not simply sell Kreuger's paper. It vouched for him. Its partners lent him their name, and the effect of that name was that other banks, regional lenders, and ordinary buyers stopped asking questions. If Boston had checked, everyone had checked. Nobody had checked. The American side of the operation was designed so that nobody could. IMCO had a corporate secretary in New York, a man named Ernst August Hoffmann, who handled the administration competently and was kept entirely away from the ledgers that mattered, which stayed in Stockholm. The Americans whose names were on the letterhead had been placed there to be looked at. What followed between 1925 and 1930 is one of the fastest accumulations of power by a private individual in the history of finance. Kreuger negotiated monopoly concessions in more than a dozen countries. He extended sovereign loans of over $300 million, and he built something to be seen in. In November 1928, the Match Palace opened in Stockholm on Västra Trädgårdsgatan. You entered through iron gates into a horseshoe courtyard paved in marble, past a bronze fountain of Diana flanked by a wild boar and a deer. Set into the paving near the door was a stone showing Prometheus bringing fire down to humanity, the theft of flame, at the entrance to a match company. Inside was a boardroom 70 feet long, curved, paneled in mahogany, built around a horseshoe table of lemon wood. 22 chairs, each inlaid with ivory marking a different country where Swedish matches were sold. Kreuger's chair sat slightly higher than the rest in the center of the curve, marked with an ivory sun. The ceiling lamps were shaped like dancing flames. One entire wall carried a 60-foot mural of Prometheus riding a winged horse down a rainbow. And at the top of the building, at the end of a long corridor, was a room he called the Silence Room. It held a desk, a sofa, and a large safe. The door locked from the inside. On the desk stood 3 telephones. The middle one was not connected to anything. It was wired to a button hidden under the floorboards, and when a visitor stayed too long, Kreuger would press it with his foot, let the phone ring, pick it up, and apologize that Mussolini was calling. He kept 88 paintings at his house on Villa Gatan, 19 of them by Anders Zorn. He kept a penthouse at 791 Park Avenue in New York. He crossed the Atlantic on the Berengaria and the Ile-de-France, and spent the crossings alone in his stateroom planning conversations he had not yet had. He wore black. Tailored suits, a heavy black overcoat, and the locket. By the end of the decade, his complexion had gone pallid, almost unearthly, and he had begun spending long stretches in total silence, moving between states of mania and depression that he disclosed to nobody. To the men who bought his securities, all of this was proof. And it was proof of something, just not the thing they thought. Here is the arithmetic that nobody at Lee Higginson ever sat down and did. Swedish Match made 20 billion boxes of matches a year. That is a staggering industrial achievement. But the profit on a box of matches is a fraction of a penny. Meanwhile, to keep American money flowing in fast enough to fund the next sovereign loan, Kreuger was paying his investors dividends that frequently ran above 20% a year, and in some years above that. No match company on earth could pay that out of matches. So it wasn't paid out of matches. It was paid out of the next investor. New bonds funded the dividends on the old bonds, and the empire had to keep growing simply to stand still. Which is the thing to understand about what Kreuger actually built. It looked like a match company. It functioned like a bank, one that borrowed short from the American public and lent long to sovereign governments with no regulator and no independent auditor ever allowed near the ledger. Every match monopoly he bought was collateral for the next round of borrowing. The matches were real. The business model was a treadmill. and he hid the treadmill beautifully. He built more than 400 subsidiaries, moving assets between them across borders, routing money through Swiss holding companies so that no single set of books ever showed the whole picture. He invented a share class, B shares carrying full dividend rights but 1/1000th of the voting power, so that the public could fund him without ever being able to question him. He demanded absolute secrecy from his own directors. Several of them accepted it. Then, on the 24th of October, 1929, Wall Street crashed. At first, Kreuger looked untouchable. His securities held their value because he kept paying those dividends out of newly raised capital. But the crash had drained the one thing the entire structure ran on, which was new money. There was no next investor, and the treadmill does not have a stop button. Some years earlier, he had gone to Italy looking for another monopoly, and Mussolini had turned him down. In the aftermath of the crash, with a hole in his balance sheet he could not close, Kreuger went back to that refusal and made it into an asset. He forged 42 Italian government promissory notes. Each carried a face value of £500,000. He printed them on heavy, official-looking paper, and he signed them himself, the Italian finance minister's name and the name of the Italian monopoly administrator, in his own hand. The typesetting was clumsy. The signatures were poor. He stamped them, locked them in his Stockholm safe, and showed them to bankers only briefly as proof that he was good for the money. It is worth stopping on that image. The most trusted financier in Europe, alone in a locked room at the top of his own palace, forging the signature of a foreign government onto paper, badly, because there was nobody left to borrow from. In 1930, he did something else. He quietly took control of the Swedish telecommunications company LM Ericsson and began using its treasury to plug the holes in his own holding companies. By early 1932, he needed to turn Ericsson back into cash, and he found a buyer, the American telecom giant ITT, for $11 million. And ITT did the one thing that nobody had done in 9 years. They asked to see the books. The auditors ITT sent in were not looking for a fraud. They were doing routine confirmation work on a purchase, checking that the assets were where the company said they were. They found that 28 million kroner listed as cash in Ericsson's accounts was not there. Kreuger had moved it to a Dutch subsidiary to cover other debts. They found it almost immediately. 9 years of European bankers, Swedish regulators, Boston partners, and American directors had accepted Ivar Kreuger's word. A team of ordinary American accountants, hired to verify a routine $11 million purchase, broke him almost immediately. Not because they were suspicious, because it was their job, and nobody had thought to exempt them from it. ITT canceled the deal and demanded its money back. That was the last exit closing. On the 11th of March 1932 in Paris, Kreuger met with his lieutenant Christer Littorin and the banker Oscar Rydbeck to prepare for one final trip to Berlin to beg for emergency funding. On his last trip to New York, he had broken down in front of colleagues, saying he couldn't think anymore, that he was going crazy. The following morning, the 12th of March, he was found dead in his flat at 5 Avenue Victor Emmanuel III. The blinds were drawn. He was lying on the bed, still in his black coat. French police and physicians recorded the death as suicide. On the desk was a note. It read in part that he had made such a mess of things that he believed this to be the best solution for everybody concerned. When the New York Stock Exchange opened the following Monday, the ticker recorded a single block sale of 673,800 American certificates. The price went to pennies. It was the largest corporate bankruptcy in history to that point. And this is where the story stops being about a Swedish industrialist and starts being about Americans. The people holding that paper were not financiers. Lee Higginson had sold Kreuger's securities down to the smallest denominations they could package, instruments the trade called baby bonds, to clerks, to widows living on the income. They had been told these were secured sinking fund gold debentures backed by the sovereign debt of European nations, paying 20 to 25%. They had been told this by a Boston bank that had been in business since 1848. Overnight, those certificates lost essentially all of their value. American retail investors absorbed a nominal loss of $250 million, close to $6 billion in today's money. Not from one wealthy man. From thousands of ordinary American households, most of whom had never heard of Kalmar, and had bought the paper for one reason: someone respectable had told them it was safe. That is what was actually stolen here. Not the money. The money was a consequence. What Kreuger took was the assumption that when an institution with a 100-year name puts its word behind a number, the number has been checked by somebody. Lee, Higginson and Company did not survive it. The firm was ruined, the partners publicly humiliated, the house dissolved. Then the accountants arrived. The Swedish Bankruptcy Commission put Price Waterhouse onto the wreckage under the direction of Sir George O. May, and it took them 5 years. They untangled more than 400 subsidiaries and issued 57 separate reports. What they found was not sophisticated. They wrote that the manipulations were so childish that anyone with even a rudimentary knowledge of bookkeeping could have seen the books were falsified. They also went further than the numbers and delivered a verdict on the man. Nothing in the real earnings, they concluded, supported the idea that Kreuger's ability was so extraordinary that it justified the freedom from oversight and disclosure he had been granted. He had not been trusted because he was brilliant. He had been trusted because trusting him was easier and because nobody wanted to be the person who asked. Over 14 years, Kreuger had reported roughly $300 million in profits. The real figure was about $40 million. There were $250 million in assets that did not exist, and $115 million that Kreuger had personally taken. Total losses to investors came to $560 million in 1932 money, around $13 billion today. The bankruptcy trustee, Irving Trust, went after the Americans who had lent their names. It sued IMCO's directors for $100 million in lost assets and $35 million more in dividends that had been paid out of capital. The named defendants read like a guest list: Percy Avery Rockefeller, sued for $31.4 million; Donald Durant, $35.7 million; Frederick Winthrop Allen, $36.2 million; Francis Lee Higginson, $21 million; Adrian Hoffman Larkin, $34.5 million. The trustee's argument was blunt. Had these men made any prudent inquiry into the company they were directing, none of the losses would have happened at all. Durant had been Kreuger's principal American liaison and a director of the company. Under questioning before the Senate's Pecora hearings, he had to admit that he had never once attended a board meeting in Sweden. The hearings widened from there. A witness named Dr. Max Winkler testified about how the collateral behind the bonds had been quietly swapped, and argued that the duty to check whether the replacement was as sound as the original belonged to the people selling the paper to the public. That was Lee Higginson. They had not checked that either. That admission did more damage than the forgeries, because the obvious question sitting in the hearing room was who exactly had been watching. At one point, Senator Alban Barkley put it to the accounting profession directly, asking who audits you. The answer came from Colonel Arthur Carter, managing partner of the accounting firm Haskins & Sells. Our conscience. Nobody in Washington accepted that answer again. The outrage over Kreuger gave Ferdinand Pecora the political fuel he needed, and out of those hearings came the Securities Act of 1933, the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Public companies were ordered to publish consolidated financial statements, and for the first time, they were required to submit to an independent audit by an outsider, a rule that exists specifically because one man was permitted to certify his own numbers for 14 years. His brother Torsten went to prison for financial irregularities in the collapse. When he came out, he spent the rest of his life, until he died in 1973, arguing that Ivar had been murdered. He and later writers pointed to inconsistencies in the autopsy, the path of the bullet, and the fact that the body was cremated quickly in France. They suggested Soviet agents, or rival Anglo-American banks. None of it has ever been proven. The official finding has never been overturned. There is a genuine argument, too, that Torsten was half right about the money. Kreuger's empire was not empty. Swedish Match was a real global manufacturer. Boliden was a genuinely lucrative gold mine. Ericsson was a foundational telecommunications company. All of them survived, were reorganized, largely under the control of the rival Wallenberg family, and all of them are still trading today. The industrial base was sound. It was the financial superstructure on top of it that was fiction, which is what made him different from the swindlers who came before. John Kenneth Galbraith, weighing him against Ponzi and the rest, called Kreuger the Leonardo of their craft. Every public company in America is audited by an outsider today. Every one of them files consolidated statements. Those rules were not written by economists. They were written in response to 42 sheets of heavy paper, signed badly, by hand, and locked in a safe in Stockholm. And they are the reason you can read a company's accounts at all. Tell me in the comments. Was Ivar Kreuger a builder who ran out of time or a forger who ran out of paper? If this was the kind of story you can't look away from, there's another one waiting. Keep watching.